We now turn to rhetorical analogies and misleading comparisons. An analogy is a comparison between two things, such as apples and oranges, llamas and squirrels, pies and cakes, or any other such things. Now, the type of analogy we look at is not an argument by analogy, nor like a metaphorical analogy, such as, saying that Juliet is like the sun. We're looking in particular at the rhetorical analogy. Later on, in part 3, we'll take a look at the argument from or by analogy. So what is a rhetorical analogy? Well, the basic idea is this. It's an analogy, so it involves comparing one thing to another. And it's rhetorical, so the objective is to make something appear better or worse, to make people feel good about it or bad about it. So a rhetorical analogy can be either negative or positive. For example, suppose you want to make a negative analogy, a negative comparison. One common way to do this is draw a comparison, say, between a person and another historical figure that is known to be rather bad. For example, we might say that someone is like Hitler, and that's kind of the extreme go-to for negative analogies, comparing one person to another. Now, we can also, of course, do positive comparisons. As an example, with the election coming up for 2016, the various Republican candidates are endeavoring to make an analogy between themselves and Ronald Reagan, and that's seen as a good comparison among Republicans. Among Democrats, they typically try to compare themselves to well-liked or beloved past Democrats. They might compare themselves to Kennedy, for example, and they most likely would not compare themselves to Jimmy Carter. Likewise, the Republicans are not likely to compare themselves to George W. Bush. Now, other types of common rhetorical analogies involve comparing people to animals, because animals have positive or negative qualities, and we often use those comparisons to say something good or something bad about a person. For example, if we wish to praise someone, we might say that Sarah is as brave as a lion. Or we might say that Sam is strong as an ox. Or that, Ted swims like a fish. And those are all positive comparisons. Now, if we want to be negative, we can, of course, make comparisons between people and animals that are unflattering. So I might say that someone eats like a pig, or that someone is sneaky like a weasel, or that someone stinks like a skunk. And those would be negative rhetorical analogies. Now, you can also make other comparisons that don't involve people. For example, a person who's critical of Social Security might compare Social Security to a Ponzi scheme, a pyramid scheme. And that, of course, be a negative comparison. Or a person might make a comparison between a person and not an animal, but an inanimate object. We might say that someone is as bright as the sun, or that a person's integrity is solid as a mountain. And we might make comparisons between, physical objects. For example, we might say that a truck is built like a rock. Or we might make comparisons between, like, a person and a company, like the classic advertising jingle, like a good neighbor, State Farm is there. And that's a rhetorical analogy. Also, we may have things that are somewhat metaphorical. We might say, for example, that Sally is a loose cannon, meaning that it's a negative comparison, meaning that she's likely to kind of blow up. Now, in terms of using these, the idea, of course, is to decide, firstly, do you want to go negative or positive? And that depends on your objective. The second thing you wish to consider is your audience, because a positive comparison for one audience might be negative for another. For example, if one is speaking to a group of neo-Nazis, then a comparison to Hitler would probably go over quite well as a positive analogy. If one is speaking to pretty much anyone else, then comparisons to Hitler are generally negative. As another example, if one is speaking to Republicans, then a comparison to Ronald Reagan is generally considered good. A comparison to, say, FDR among Republicans, probably not so great. Now, in terms of on the side of defending against it, the idea basically to do is ask yourself, well, okay, that's perhaps an interesting analogy, but is the comparison actually correct? Is, for example, what the person is doing, does that really make the person like a Nazi? If someone is said to be, have an integrity as Saul of the mountains, yeah, that's a nice thing to say, but is that actually true? So as always, one of the main defenses against rhetoric is to inquire whether it's true or not. So a quick recap, a rhetorical analogy is a comparison between things to make one of them appear better or worse. And next, we'll move on to looking at misleading comparisons and then on to the questions. Now, in regards to misleading comparisons, to do kind of the lead-in, there are many claims that make comparisons that require additional clarification. These are often used in advertising. For example, we might be told that using some sort of product may cut your bill by up to half. Or there may be, packaging, like you might see a cereal, and the box may say, now 25% larger. Or you may be looking at a washing machine, and it might have a sticker on it saying, quietest by far. And of course, there's always the classic new and improved, which is seen on a wide range of products. So, a good question is, how do we deal with such claims? Well, in many cases, these claims are quite vague. As we saw in the ancient days of the previous section, a claim is vague is lacking in precision. It's not exact enough for the purpose at hand. And, just as we saw previously with vagueness, the amount of vagueness that's acceptable depends very much on the context. For example, suppose you buy a house, and you know that getting your attic insulated will cut your bill by 15 to 45%. Well, that's a pretty broad range, in terms of the comparison. But assume the insulation is reasonably priced, that could be precise enough to give you a reason to insulate. Because if say it's only 15%, that could still easily be enough to pay for itself very quickly. Now, there are also some claims that are simply too vague to be meaningful. For example, typically like in advertising, someone might say, have more fun in Arizona. And the good question is, more fun than what? More fun than a root canal? More fun than being attacked by a pack of rabid, deranged zombie squirrels? Another example, suppose a detergent promises to get clothes whiter than white. I'm not even sure what that could possibly mean. Or, a gum might claim to deliver more tasteful taste. And again, not particularly meaningful. Now, there are a variety of ways to be misleading in comparisons. One interesting way, or perhaps boring way, is the use of misleading graphics. The way information is presented can lead to distorted comparisons. For example, a chart might distort a graphic by expanding the scale at a certain point. And the textbook contains some examples of how this technique might be used. Now, there's also the concern about how people can mislead with percentages. Be wary of, what seem to be large increases percentage-wise. For example, there was a 166% increase in cocaine use among Americans aged 12 to 17 from 1992 to 1995. Now, 166% sounds like a huge amount. But of course, in order to know if that's huge or not huge, we have to know the starting point. Now, what it turns out to be is that it was originally 0.3% of the population of that age range, and a 166% increase went from 0.3 to 0.8%, which is an increase, and you don't want more kids on cocaine as a general rule, but in terms of absolute numbers, that is not as impressive or as large as the 166% seems to sound. So the takeaway is be wary of misleading graphics, be wary of claims that are so vague to be meaningless, and be wary of misleading percentages. And next, we'll take a look at the various questions one should ask when comparisons are being made. But that'll be put into another video in case of short attention spans. So that ends the stuff for this exciting video about stuff.